Welcome back to the Lawfather Podcast. As always, we're here in Lawfather headquarters. We had an interesting past couple of weeks. We missed last week, so I apologize about that. And the week before, we did a spot with Ian Beckles on In the Trenches, another podcast that's here with Radio Influence. So big shout out to Radio Influence and putting all of us together and putting all these good shows and allowing us to kind of cross-pollinate our shows. But anyway, as we move through and look into some of the legal topics for today, here in Tampa we have, I don't want to say it's interesting, but it is kind of interesting in terms of a criminal trial. I don't want to say it's interesting because the crime itself was pretty bad. I don't even necessarily want to get into the details. You can read the news about it. The testimony's been pretty graphic, and it's one of those stories that you look at and go, yeah, there really are really bad people in this world who do really bad things. So, not to turn it into a political sense, but think about that the next time you're talking about, hey, we should defund the police, or, that the police have not a hard job, or maybe we should use a social worker, because there truly is evil. And I think that this particular case really does hit on that. And it's the Ronnie Oneal trial here in Tampa. And the crime occurred in unincorporated Hillsborough County. I believe it occurred in Riverview, Florida, which for those of you outside of Florida that don't know, we have these large unincorporated areas. They're kind of like towns. Those of you in the Northeast, it's more or less like a town, except for there's no individual governing body. It just becomes a name for an area. The governing body for those areas is the Board of County Commissioners and the Sheriff's Office. Okay, that's how that works. Generally speaking, they have their own fire rescue, at least here in Hillsborough County. Pinellas County does as well. So, and I believe the other counties have a very, very similar setup, although we do have some rural counties here, so they may differ some, but in your more populated counties, that's the setup. But anyway, the courthouse, for those of you not familiar, is located in Tampa, in downtown Tampa. So we're talking about a trial that is happening here. And I think what makes this interesting, well, let me take a step back. It's a trial about a double murder, okay? And the alleged murderer killed wife or girlfriend, child, a disabled child, and attempted to murder I believe it was a 9-year-old. So I think it was 11, 9, and then mom, okay? And then set the house on fire, right? That's why it's just, I don't want to get into the details of it, okay? I spent 6 years in law enforcement trying to avoid the goriest of the gory. And from reading some of the testimony about this particular case, I would say that this really hits that, right? This hits really probably the worst that humanity can do. But anyway, I digress from the legal side of it, which is really why you listen to me. You don't necessarily want my breakdown of society and politics, so I'm not going to give it to you. So let's look at this. And why is this particular case interesting, right? Because on its face, it's just a case, right? Now, look, right? We know the severity level of it. Now, the Ronnie Oneal is the alleged murderer, and he faces the death penalty. All right, we have the death penalty here in Florida, and that is on the table for this particular case. Now, if you're a lawyer, okay, I do criminal law sometimes, right? I don't do a lot. I keep it really contained if I take on a criminal case, right? It has to be a friend of a friend, okay, or a friend, although I haven't had to actually represent a friend. I don't necessarily have a lot of friends going out and committing crimes. But be that as it may, a really good client who has a friend, or there's usually some tie-in to somebody that I know, whether it's professionally or personally, okay? That's really where I start, and usually it's either a drug charge or a DUI charge. I don't generally step outside of that, although I have in the past, and not sure I necessarily want to do that again, but I have in the past. I have stepped outside of that in the past for somebody who needed my help. And with all of that, and even with 6 years of law enforcement experience, you couldn't hire me to defend you in a death penalty case. Yeah, right? You couldn't. And now, why not? I'm a lawyer. I can go practice in criminal law. I'm licensed to practice in state court, which is where this is. Why couldn't I? Well, when you're talking about a capital crime, a crime that comes with the death penalty, there are certain rules, right? You have to, and look, I could, right? I could do what I need to do death penalty cases. There is nothing within me that makes me have any desire to do that whatsoever. I just don't. Just not something that is in my wheelhouse, not something that, I think mentally I want to take on. But, basically, and I've looked at the parameters in the past, but it's something along the lines, you have to sit second chair. So basically, you're an assistant to the attorney who's the lead person, right? And they're running the show, and you're there. You have to do a few trials like that. So be that as it may, you couldn't hire me for your death penalty case. Why am I talking about all of this? Why is that what makes this case a little bit more interesting? Because Ronnie Oneal is representing himself. He doesn't have an attorney. He convinced the court that he should represent himself, right? And in a case like this, you have to get the court to agree that that's okay, right? Now, look, there's case law on this. I know there is. I haven't looked it up, but I know that there is, right? Because issues that are this big always have case law to it. And you essentially create an issue for appeal. Either way this judge rules, right? Whether, hey, you have to have an attorney or no, you can represent yourself. Now, by representing himself, he still has attorneys at the table with him, okay? And at the table with him, I mean, if you look at the setup, right, you have the bar, that is what separates the public viewing access to the attorneys, and the prosecutor has a table and the defense has a table. So at his table, there's at least one attorney, and it's a public defender. There may be two, and kind of guiding him through the process in this, okay? But he's still the one up there doing all of the talking, right? There's a saying that goes, a lawyer who has himself as a client is a fool. Okay, there's a reason for that, right? And you can see it, and I've read kind of the daily updates on this case, and number one, it's a bad case, but number two, you hire an attorney partially to take the emotional element out of it, and when you're on trial for murder and your opening statement includes you screaming and yelling at the jury, probably not a good place to start, okay? Just going to go out there and go with, generally if you're murdering somebody, generally there's some aggression that comes along with it, and generally speaking, when you're yelling at somebody, there's some bit of aggression that goes along with it, so probably not the best move, right? Probably not the way an attorney who was representing him would have started off, but there's other things that come up, right? Because you, who is on trial, is the one that is doing all of the direct examination, the cross-examination, right? All of those pieces. And you get this interesting dynamic where these witnesses, right? And by witnesses, I don't necessarily mean they saw exactly what happened, okay? Now, there was a witness who saw exactly what happened, which is what makes this case probably even worse, okay? Because the 9-year-old is an eyewitness to this whole thing. But in the legal system, when we talk about a witness, we're talking about anybody who's testifying, okay? So they may not have seen the exact crime that happened, right? But they were somehow involved in it. And when a law enforcement officer can get up there and is being asked questions and goes, "I arrested you?" Man, that's really strong with a jury, right? Versus, I went and I arrested the defendant. Pretty cold, pretty, even keel, doesn't really have a lot of passion behind it. But when you can legitimately point to the person who's asking you the questions and go, "I arrested you," man, that's a tough spot, right? That's really not a good look for a jury. You're not going to get, I don't think, a lot of brownie points with a jury. And then to complicate matters even more, you have, I believe it was a 9-year-old child that survived this, who saw what happened and can testify, I saw you do this, I saw you do that, you did this to me? Come on. I mean, just not a smart play, in my opinion. Not really sure how you win that battle, but be that as it may, they'll be starting closing arguments this week, and it's the week of the 21st. I would imagine closing arguments will probably be done today if they start them today, and jury deliberations will start immediately after that. Jury deliberations are when the jury takes, they go back in their room, and they have all the evidence, and they determine whether he's guilty or not guilty, and it has to be unanimous. So, and then it'll move on to a sentencing phase. So, as we move through this, I'll break it down once we look at the sentencing phase, and maybe we take a look at what the death penalty part looks like on it, and kind of go from there. So that's the Ronnie Oneal trial, and that's how that all looks and plays out. So that's the breakdown on the Ronnie Oneal trial, and what I want to look at next, and what I was planning on doing, and let me just share this with you because we're going to bump this to next week. We're going to get into the assault rifle ban. There was a lot that went on in the past couple of weeks, and I wanted to kind of push it all into one show. But I don't want to short either one of those, but I also don't want to create a show that's massively long to listen to. So I'm going to bump the California assault rifle ban overturn, right, into next week, and we're going to talk about that next week. What I do want to get into right now is a listener question. I do appreciate all the listener questions. Lawfather at TampaLawfather.com, or text me at 855-LAWFATHER. You can also call me at that number if you want to reach out to me and talk to me. But this is an interesting one. The question goes like this. I live in a gated community, and I was driving home one day from work, and I was probably going a little fast, and I got stopped and was given a ticket. Is that allowed? Okay. Now, it brings up an interesting point, all right? And I think one of the biggest things to look at there is it's a gated community. And usually a gated community means that the roads are private, all right? Now, law enforcement in Florida, right when we talk about these things, we're always talking about Florida. I'm not talking about any other state because, I don't really know the laws in any other state. So in Florida, if you're on private property, law enforcement can't give you a ticket. Okay, that's the general rule. Like that's what we start with, right? Now, as the kind of the saying goes, there's an exception to every rule, but generally speaking, when you're in a gated community, the roads are private, and therefore it's private property. All right, so those of you who live mostly in the county areas, mostly in the unincorporated areas of Hillsborough County, you see this a lot. You see these gated communities, and the HOA is responsible for maintaining the roads, speed limits. The HOA may even have some ability to levy fines for improper driving actions. Just kind of a lot of it depends on the bylaws. But as a general rule, law enforcement doesn't have the ability to write a ticket, right? And look, I've been hired by HOAs when I was a deputy. Well, not me. I did the work personally, but the way it worked, they would put a post in, and it would be a big pool, and you could choose. The deputies could choose to do these off-duty jobs, and I would take these HOA community jobs because they were generally pretty easy. And generally speaking, the most of them, you couldn't write anybody a ticket. You were just there to help slow people down, right? They're just the presence of it. But getting back to the question, can you? Well, it depends, because there is an exception to this rule, and that exception is this. If there is an agreement and it's posted in the bylaws, right, because you have to know about it, but if there's an agreement between the HOA and law enforcement and it's contracted that law enforcement enforce the traffic laws within the community, then yes, you can get a ticket. Okay? So, like most good legal questions, the answer is it depends. All right? So anyway, as the Lawfather here, we talked a little bit about Ronnie Oneal. Next week, we're going to get into the assault rifle ban. And, hey, in your HOA, you may or may not be able to get a ticket if you're speeding in your community. Right from Lawfather headquarters, Lawfather out.